Dropped from the wing of a B-52 bomber, the X-15 rips through the sound barrier, climbing to new heights. Designed to explore the limits of speed and altitude, the X-15 sets a string of aviation records on its way to changing history. Tonight, fly with the aircraft that opened the door to space. By late 1960, North American Aviation's X-15 had gone higher and faster than any aircraft had flown before, thrusting man and machine into the unknown. On August 4th, 1960, test pilot Joe Walker took the X-15 well beyond 3 times the speed of sound, making him the fastest man alive. 8 days later, Air Force Captain Bob White climbed to new heights, taking the X-15 over 136,000 feet. This was just the beginning of an incredible program that would take man to extremes. By this time, a new generation of test pilot had emerged, men with dreams of going into space. Before reaching such ambitious goals, these men would need to train tirelessly in simulated cockpits. Here, NASA pilot Milt Thompson is becoming acquainted with the complex array of systems he would later validate in flight. The simulator was a relatively new training tool, which would become vital in preparing this new generation of pilots for future flights. Revolutionary pressure suits monitored the effects of weightlessness and extraordinary G-forces. However, these suits clearly provided little in the way of pilot comfort.
It was kind of like a sausage skin, and the more you blew it up, why, the more trouble you had bending your elbows and your knees, and the workload got very high then in what we called a hard or a pressurized suit.
This modified F-104 would become a kind of flying simulator because its landing characteristics were similar to the X-15's. The F-104 would trace the X-15's flight corridor, following a series of tracking stations along the mountains of Utah and Nevada. By late 1961, all 3 X-15s were finally together at Edwards in flying condition. NASA's request for 3 X-15s had been fulfilled, and from now on, these aircraft would take turns breaking new records in both speed and altitude. The 3rd X-15, refurbished after an on-ground explosion, was now the most advanced of the 3. Equipped with a control system that could adapt to changing atmospheric density. The X-15 was refueled slowly overnight before a mission to avoid thermal shock to the airframe from the super-cold liquid oxygen propellant. Test pilot Bill Dana was aware of the volatility of the propellants used in the X-15. Their presence made sitting in the cockpit like sitting on a 17,000-pound bomb, but this didn't seem to bother Dana.
Gasoline's very explosive too, but we all drive automobiles that use it. And the same was true of the ammonia and the liquid oxygen, that under the proper circumstances they could have been explosive, but I never considered it a dangerous airplane at all. Quite the other. I was quite confident that the X-15 would get me home.
The X-15 would get Bill Dana home, but not before giving him the ride of his life. This white rectangle on the X-15's underside is frost caused by the liquid oxygen tank within the fuselage. All 9 tons of LOX and ammonia would be swallowed up by the powerful XLR-99 rocket engine in less than 2 minutes after ignition. This short period of thrust would be enough to leave the chase planes far behind in the quest to Mach 6. Despite all the simulator training, there was no substitute for the real thing.
It went from Mach 1 to Mach 6 in about 85 seconds, and it went from Mach 5 to Mach 6 in about 8 seconds. So it was, you knew you were hauling the freight when you flew the X-15.
Because of the excessive G-forces encountered, certain cockpit controls were modified because they were difficult to reach during the massive acceleration.
It was a tremendous physical effort to reach your hand out and grab the throttle to shut the engine down. That was a strong physical effort. You were just pinned back in the seat, basically, is what it was, and everything required 3 times as much effort as it would have under 1G.
Bill Dana would go on to fly 15 successful flights, including one on August 21st, 1968, for which he was awarded astronaut wings. Later missions carried out further exo-atmospheric research, like the effects of micrometeorites on aircraft, as well as high-altitude photography, crucial data in paving the way for future space exploration. Dreams of creating an orbital vehicle that combined great speed and altitude with the landing capability of the X-15 resulted in the X-20. In many ways, the X-20's origins can be traced to the German engineers Eugene Senger and Irene Brett, who in the 1930s believed that a manned aircraft could skip on top of the atmosphere. Like the Mercury capsule, the X-20 was to be thrust into space aboard a series of ballistic booster rockets that would fall away as fuel was used up. The X-20 would finally enter orbit, but on re-entry it became very different from the Mercury system. Unlike the Mercury capsule, which would glide earthward on a very steep angle and under minimal control, the X-20, with its delta wing configuration, would make a fully controlled glide at a very shallow angle. Despite the shallow descent of the X-20, re-entry would heat parts of the airframe up to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. To counter this, engineers investigated new exotic alloys, ceramic components, and a cooling water wall between the inner and outer skin of the fuselage. Despite the X-20's potential, political bickering and budget constraints resulted in cancellation of the project before it could get off the ground. At the same time, the X-15 program was going strong and pilots were going higher than ever. However, this simulator training failed to prepare them for the flying conditions of space, where conventional aerodynamic control was lost. Other means of control needed to be learned. This is the Iron Cross simulator, utilizing hydrogen peroxide thrusters to control movement. Attaching small thrusters like this to the aircraft provided a reaction system that could help control a plane at very high altitude, where normal aerodynamic forces weren't present. This concept was first tested in the X-1B. The NF-104, a rocket-boosted jet-powered aircraft, also successfully tested the reaction control system. The hydrogen peroxide thrusters were mounted on the wingtips and nose. These thrusters would prove invaluable as pilots pushed the X-15 to the edges of space. Time had come to break through the threshold into space. Bob White was chosen to make the attempt. On July 17, 1962, Bob White pulled away from the Earth at a 41-degree climb angle towards the stars. He quickly passed Joe Walker's previous altitude record, and before he knew it, had peaked at 314,000 feet, an astronomical 59.6 miles above the Earth. When White saw the entire western seaboard clear to Mexico, he knew he was in space. The third X-15, with all of its elaborate control systems uniquely designed for high-altitude flight, had clearly proved its worth, making it the highest aircraft ever flown. Bob White was the first to take a winged aircraft into space and return it safely to Earth. The following day, at a White House ceremony, President John F. Kennedy awarded Bob White, Scott Crossfield, Joe Walker, and Navy Commander Forrest Peterson the Collier Trophy, aviation's highest honor. Air Force rules state that any military pilot flying over 50 miles high was considered an astronaut. White had exceeded this threshold and was awarded astronaut wings by General Curtis LeMay. Many pilots would now have the unique opportunity to experience spaceflight. Bill Dana was one of them.
The sky is absolutely black, just totally black, and then the horizon appears as a ring of bright blue just around the surface of the Earth. And it's not disorienting at all to be up at the altitudes I was at. I knew where the Earth was and what level flight was. I didn't have any trouble controlling my airplane. I was usually busy when I was up there, so I never had much time to sightsee, but I do remember one flight I went to 300,000 feet, and just over the top I took the time to look out, and I looked out and could see the Pacific Ocean to my right and the Gulf of California straight ahead of me. And that was an awesome sight.
This was not enough for Joe Walker, now embarking on his last mission. On August 22, 1963, Walker rocketed away from the launch plane, minutes later reaching over 354,000 feet, the highest the X-15 would ever go. After the Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit, U.S. policy shifted toward ballistic research, using rockets capable of sending man into space with relative ease. While the Apollo and Mercury programs flourished, the X-20 program fell victim to this shift. Now, orbiting men in capsules rather than winged aircraft became a priority.
Roger, you got the full...
Meanwhile, the X-15 program was having its own problems. On November 9, 1962, test pilot Jack McKay was forced to make an emergency landing after an engine malfunction. During touchdown, the left landing gear fractured. McKay survived, but sustained serious injury. Ironically, this accident would result in the construction of the fastest airplane ever. In just over a year, the X-15 number 2 transformed into the X-15A2. External fuel tanks would provide the extra fuel to give additional thrust. It was now an aircraft capable of taking its pilot to new extremes. Creating an aircraft capable of going 8 times the speed of sound almost proved easier than protecting it from the blistering heat encountered at such speeds. Heat friction was particularly destructive to the leading edges of the wing and tail surfaces. Coatings of paint were used on wind tunnel models to expose these potential hotspots. It was decided that before each mission, the aircraft would be covered with a resin-based coating that would boil off at high speeds, taking the heat with it. Air Force Captain William Pete Knight was chosen to push the X-15 to its absolute speed limit. Knight had been slated for spaceflight in the X-20, but after program cancellation, he joined the X-15 program, replacing Major Robert Rushworth. The A-2 had another unique feature. Because the ablative coating chars off at extreme speeds, the left windshield would need to remain covered to protect it from being coated with the residue. When the worst was over, the eyelid was opened, and the pilot would have a clear windshield to look through as he made his final approach and landing. After several familiarization flights, Pete Knight was ready to take the A-2 to new extremes. The A-2 was also equipped with a mock-up scramjet mounted on the ventral fin stub. NASA was interested in testing scramjet propulsion systems which depend on hypersonic velocities to achieve combustion. After the drop, Knight ignited the powerful XLR-99 engine and pointed the nose upwards. With the external fuel tanks and ablative coating, the X-15 was finally an aircraft that could keep up with its huge engine. In just over a minute, the external tanks were jettisoned as the aircraft pushed to its maximum speed. Prior to landing, the dummy scramjet needed to be jettisoned as well. Pete Knight had reached the blistering speed of Mach 6.7, over 4,500 miles per hour, making the X-15 the fastest winged aircraft ever. The A-2 had finally validated the intentions of its original designers. Pete Knight was now the fastest man alive, but the aircraft had paid the price. The heat stresses were far worse than predicted. Even with the protective coating, the airframe was severely damaged. The scramjet mount had burnt through and fallen away.
On the flight to Mach 6.7, why the wake of the dummy ramjet, the Mach waves coming off the dummy ramjet impinged on the ventral fin and cut holes in both sides of it and did damage to substructures and the subsystems inside the ventral fin.
Pete Knight had been unaware of the devastating extent of the aircraft's damage. The ablative coating on the leading edges had charred through, causing serious structural problems. Furthermore, Mach 6.7 was not even close to the speed that NASA needed to carry out research on the scramjet system. And there was no money in the budget to repair and modify the crippled aircraft. The A-2 was the first X-15 retired from the program. Just over a month later, on November 15, 1967, X-15 number 3 would be completely lost. This tragic mission began without a problem. Air Force pilot Michael Adams took the aircraft to over Mach 5. Then something went terribly wrong. Adams had somehow gotten off course, and on re-entry found himself in a spin. At 5 times the speed of sound, this was too much for the airframe, which disintegrated. Michael Adams did not survive. This cockpit footage provides an eerie reminder of the dangers of experimental flight. The only X-15 left was X-15 number 1, the first of the 3 to be built. This aircraft would fly 8 more missions, but never again to the extremes of speed and altitude that were accomplished by its 2 counterparts. The X-15's final missions further examined the obstacles of spaceflight. However, by the late 60s, landing man on the moon became a national priority, and interest in the X-15 program began to wane. When Bill Dana touched down on October 24, 1968, completing the 199th mission, no one realized that this was the last X-15 flight. It was intended the program would finish by year's end with the 200th flight. 10 unsuccessful launch attempts later, the program was canceled. Relics of history, the 2 surviving X-15s now sit silently as museum pieces. Much of their data remaining on the shelf while man tried to reach the moon. There remains speculation as to whether advancements like the space shuttle would have come earlier had we taken up the X-15's legacy sooner. The X-15's first pilot, Scott Crossfield.
We've milked that database dry. You know, we've used it all, and we're really out of it now. But no, the X-15, as far as useful information for the progress of aeronautics and space, is one of the most productive programs we ever had.
The X-15 bequeathed a truly great legacy, taking men to the extremes and beyond.
Coming up, from transportation vehicle to deadly weapon, explore the use of helicopters from the viewpoints of the airborne cavalry and the air rescue. Stay with us for Chopper.